Hope everybody's doing well out there. Got some interesting things today to talk about. And we're going to be doing something, starting out with something anyway, that's long overdue. Through his continued hard work, what's his name? The guy who I'm on TV with. Is it Steve? Somebody will tell me. Who do I do Bill Whittle now with? And the guy who's on with Steve Green with me on a right angle. It slipped my mind. It'll show up in a second. Oh, yeah, Scott Ott, that's the guy. So as it turns out, Scott Ott has been working very hard, as always, on the website. And what he's managed to do is to install an actual forum there. So today, boys and girls, we're gonna talk. We're gonna take the questions from the BillWhittle.com members page first. I think there's like 9 of them. If we get through those, then we will go and do Facebook. But the questions on the members only page are very good, and certainly, God knows the members deserve a little love around here. So, oops, going the wrong way. Now, before we start, I have something really big that I want to talk about. And I am now just finished episode 7 of the Cold War, and moving on to part 8. And when I'm done with that, when I'm done with the series, I'll be able to go back to doing some firewalls. You know, each one of these episodes is 8 or 9 firewalls, I would say, something like that. Some of them are 10 firewalls long. Just to do one of these 1-hour podcasts. They're very good, and what they've done with the Daily Wire over there is just absolutely amazing in terms of the audio work. It's just the same degree of technical excellence that we had on the Apollo thing. So I'm very, very excited about it, and I think it's really well written. I have to say, I really, really like it. That's just a prelude to say that the stuff I want to talk about now, I'm going to develop more, and I'm going to end up making a firewall out of this, and hopefully it'll get some play. I want to tell you about an experience I had a couple nights ago. I went to a relatively small event to hear a guy who was researching just how much bias Google and Foghorn put into Google and Foghorn. Google, YouTube, and all the rest of them put into suppression of conservative video. And suffice it to say that it's a lot. And suffice it further to say that that during the evening, I learned how much more they were doing than I thought, but I didn't. It wasn't anything that knocked me off my plate, but it did kind of knock me off my plate when he said that the average person who's been online for several years, if you'd care to guess how much information Google has on you, he said the number for the average person in the database, the amount of data that Google has on you, he said, is 300 million pages of data. It seems an incredible number, doesn't it? But I suppose it's not. I suspect that that number is as big as it is because every single mouse click you've ever made has been tracked. Every single website you've ever visited has been tracked. And I'd be willing to bet you, given that size of a file, screenshots have been taken of either websites you're going to, or whatever video you might have shared online has been recorded and kept there in its own little file and stuff. But that's just for the average person, 300 million views. And he also said he'd done some experimental work, some actual scientific experiments, and was able to determine that just by ordering the search results, not by specifically excluding stuff, but just by the order in which the search results came in. He said that we found that we could swing between 20 and 40% of a vote in a case like that. by controlling the information that the people had, or not even controlling the information so much as the order in which they got information, which really is the same thing. He also pointed out, this is just parenthetical, but if you've noticed some time ago, when you do a Google search, it used to set up a whole series of links, Wikipedia usually on the top. Now, if you search for a question on Google, like who's the first president of the United States, you will get an answer box. You'll get a box that has all of the relevant information in there. I don't remember what percentage doesn't go past the answer box, but I want to say it's 70%. So not only do they order the sequence for you, but now you're not even going to websites to get the answer. You're basically just taking Google's word for it. And 20 to 40% of an electorate is enough. It gets a lot more interesting. This is the prelude for what I want to talk about today. So we listened for an hour about what is actually going on. And we listened to what they're doing, and we listened to how they're doing. And then there were a bunch of questions afterwards. And everybody's asking questions about the what and the how. And I think I was the last or second last person to raise my hand. And I looked up at this guy and I raised my hand. He called on me and I said, "What do they want?" It looked a little surprised by that. And then the person in front of me said, "They want the power to control people's minds." Yeah, and then he said something like, "Yes, they're looking for absolute control." And at that point, I didn't press the issue because that's just a simple step back. Yes, they want control. Why do they want control? Yes, they want to control people's minds. To what end do they want to control people's minds? I've never heard anybody ask this question before. What do they want? An interesting question also is, what would the world look like if they get what they want? But we can't even deal with that until we know what they want. What do they want? Political power, yes. And they want Democrats to win, yes. And they want Hillary to win because she's more in line with their philosophy. All of this stuff is true. But to what end? I'm not talking to people like Maxine Waters or Bernie Sanders, who are multimillionaires by ginning up the great unwashed. I'm talking about the people who run these tech companies, who have enormous power, certainly more power to influence people than has ever existed in the world before. And I don't know what they want. If you had, well, I think I do, and that was the big breakthrough idea that I'm going to bounce past you guys first, and I'll compact it. But if you ask me what does Adolf Hitler want, I would say Adolf Hitler wants Germany to be revenge for the Treaty of Versailles, wants to be the master of Europe militarily, wants to take over the area that we call the Soviet Union and the Ukraine and Poland, which they would staff with members of that population, greatly reduced, to create the food supply for the master race, which lives in Germany and is Nordic or Aryan in nature. And not only is he wanting to do that, he also wants to eliminate every single Jew that he can get his hands on. I think that's a pretty succinct description of what Adolf Hitler wanted. So what do these guys want? Can anybody answer that? This is the thing I find very interesting and why I'm excited about this idea. No one talks about this. They talk about how they're doing what they're doing. They talk about what's going on. And when you ask them why they're doing it, the why, all you get is crickets. You get, for power, for control. And that was the answer I was going with this whole time too. Power for what? Control for what? To what end? And that's when things start to get interesting. So this is going to be a bit of a stretch, but it hit me. It's one of those thunderbolt moments, one of the 5 or 6 I've had in the course of my life. So I'm gonna do a little deep drilling here, and you're just going to have to come with me on this. Somebody mentioned, Eric mentioned in the comments that it's a lust for power, to overcome an inferiority complex, and Simon says it want to eliminate the flyover county mentality, and all of that's correct. But it's not what motivates them. A person's, to the degree that they have inferiority complexes, you're not motivated to do the kind of work, spend the kind of money, and put the kind of effort into this that everybody in the top tech concerns are doing. But in any event, I think I figured out what they want. So now it's time to start to drill a little deeper. He had pointed out, the guy giving the speech had pointed out that I should look for a video, which I wrote down as the selfish letter. And it's an internal video made by the top people at Google, not for the average Google worker, but for executives, high-level executives at Google. What this video was an in-house, highly secret video designed to make it clear to the upper echelon that this is the corporate policy of Google. This is why we're doing everything that we do, and so on. And I've said many, many years now that when the end of the world comes, it'll be announced with a British accent. And sure enough, I was not wrong. It's an 8-minute video. I thought, well, how come this is so damaging? It's so damaging. Why can I find it? Why can I find it? Then I realized that I think the people at Google are smart enough to know about the Streisand effect, which, if you're not familiar with, somebody flew over Streisand's house and took a picture and offered to sell her a picture of her house from the air. She said, "You're not allowed to photograph my property from the air. I don't want anybody looking at my property." And since she said that she owns the airspace over the house, then millions of people started looking at the property. Bo Monday put the link to it in the comment section, but I'd really appreciate it if you didn't go just yet, because there's no point in seeing it now, and when you see it later, it'll be made clear to you. So I went searching for it, and sure enough, I couldn't find anything. And then I realized I had misheard the guy. It's not the selfish letter. It's called the selfish ledger. Please don't go look at it yet. You have plenty of time to go look at it later. But you really need to stay with me on this because this is an exceedingly complex issue. So the selfish ledger is the ethical code of Google, and I will infer by that it's also the ethical code of virtually all the people in big tech. Now for the drilling. One of the people they mentioned in the video is a guy named Lamarck, who had the idea that evolution could pass down inherited traits. If you learn something during your life, then you could pass that learning down through genetics. Not true. But he said, nevertheless, it provides an interesting model for something else. And then he referenced a guy who many of you have heard of, named Richard Dawkins. Richard Dawkins is probably king of the atheists. He's the champion of atheism, written several books on atheism. But what he really is a molecular biologist. He understands DNA and structures and genes and all the rest of it. And I don't know how long ago, might have been 30 years now, 25 certainly 20. He wrote of an extremely influential book called The Selfish Gene. So, what is it? What is the essence of what the selfish gene is saying? The selfish gene is saying this. Dawkins says that you can look at it. In fact, it's probably a better way to look at life. Not as we are individual people who have genes that make us who we are, but rather that we are essentially walking robots that carry the genes through the food cycle and allow the genes to be reproduced. He comes to this many times. He talks about us as essentially as like living robots that perpetuate the gene, and he said it's a much better way to think of things if you see humanity as the genetic code, and that the individuals around us are just containers for that genetic code. Okay. As it turns out, that is an extremely interesting and effective way to think about what evolution appears to be doing genetically. And what he said is, even though genes obviously don't have consciousness, because they're conducting billions of trial and error experiments, the behavior of genes and genetics will act as if it's intelligent. In other words, it's completely random, but it is moving down the path that's best for the gene. And so the essential element in the selfish gene was this revelation that people are actually simply just buckets that the genes inhabit for a period of time, and then they go on to the next person in the genetic line that goes all the way back to the beginning. So that is an interesting idea and a little disturbing. And having been an atheist for probably 3/4 of my life, but I wasn't when I read the book. I realized that what he was doing with this, I realized that there's an emotional underpinning to this intellectual idea, and it works something like this. If you're the Soviet Union, and you are an atheistic society, and you've told all of your citizens that there's no such thing as God, and then you've got a bunch of young men there, and you tell them that they are going to have to go into that city of Stalingrad, and they're all going to be killed. How do you get them to do that? What is the emotional connection to it? And this whole conversation is going to be about emotional drivers, not about rational ones, because rational ones are not what drive people. So what they ended up doing, and Hitler did this too, is very straightforward. They basically said to the Russian soldiers, these atheistic soldiers, yes, it's true that you'll be killed in there, but you'll die for the state. And since you'll die for the state, you're part of the state. So even though you will die, the state lives on. And that means you live on. You live on as well, because you have been subsumed by the state. You've been ingested by it. This sacrifice of yours will continue the state's existence, and you are a part of the state. Therefore, you are immortal. And that is how many, many people, both in the Nazi Party and the Communist Party, went to their deaths. They would die screaming, "Long live Stalin, long live Hitler." But what they're doing emotionally is they are having their individual identity. And I think this is a universal thing for everybody, including atheists and including scientists. I think virtually everybody's afraid of dying, and I think virtually everybody is interested in some sort of afterlife. Now, it's a point of pride among atheists. In fact, that's the definition of an atheist, is that there's no afterlife, there's no God, there's none of that. But what Dawkins is dangling in front of them is the same thing that the Soviets were dangling in front of their soldiers. It's a form of immortality. And the more that you identify with that idea, the easier your personal extinction becomes. If you really start to think of yourself as just simply an element of the state, and you transfer your identity to the state. I am the state. The state is all of us, and I'm in it. And the state lives forever, so therefore I'm going to live forever. This body is just a servant of the state. Then you're doing what Dawkins is doing in The Selfish Gene. You're transferring your individual desires for survival into an immortal intellectual construction that gives you eternal life, and essentially, dying is you're not dying. All that's dying is the robot, is the little walking eating machine that the gene is carrying. The gene is really you. That's what they're saying. And I could see the emotional drivers in that. I don't have any evidence of this other than the fact that it makes perfect sense to me and emotional sense to me. And so stay with me on this. So that's basically the selfish gene. We are unique individuals, but that's not the point. These unique individuals are here simply so the genes can replicate themselves and continue on forever. Now, why would Google name their in-house philosophy video The Selfish Ledger? I thought it was The Selfish Letter, as I said. So I started to watch The Selfish Ledger. And this is pretty scary stuff. And it's scary because it's so precisely intellectual and so unemotional in the delivery. When you watch The Selfish Ledger, the first point they make is, they said ever since the advent of computers, people have been making decisions. They've been making choices online, and we can record those decisions. And the choices that people make go into that individual's ledger. That's the term they used. And in this case, ledger means a complete listing, as in an accounting ledger. It's a complete list of everything that you've ever done online. And as time has gone on, and more of this data is collected, the argument is being made that as the ledger becomes more and more refined and more complicated, it becomes more and more predictable. And that alone is a little disturbing, but then it got to the part that really should scare the living hell out of you. So then Mr. Calm, soy boy British accent, very, very bright sounding guy says, but what if the ledger was not just a record of things that we've already done. What if we could turn the ledger into an objective? What if we could say that the ledger needs to be pointed in a direction that best benefits mankind? They use that sentence once, I think, in the whole video, just for the sake of it. When they say best benefits mankind, they mean benefits them, but stay with me on this. They said, what if this ledger of all of your decisions didn't just extend behind you, but what if we could maneuver this ledger and maneuver the data so that the decisions that you make are going to be gently channeled into a certain direction, and we think that direction is good for humanity, which means good for us. Okay. And then they said something that's even scarier. They said, if you look at people this way, that alone should get your attention. The narrator said, you'll realize that the ledger is actually cross-generational, that the ledger remains, and that all of the choices that you make constitute essentially who you are, and they're kept in a ledger, and those ledgers are transgenerational. All the choices you made when you die, they'll continue to be part of this gigantic database that will then be used to help influence people's decisions in a way that people who know how to make these decisions want. And I realized when I heard this, that what he's doing, I'm going to use the term here just because it's easy to use. I'm going to use the term meme, not as a picture or cartoon or anything. I'm going to use the word meme as a kind of an individual unit of thought. The best way to think of memes that have been described this way before, think of a meme as a gene of thought. It's a thought that combines with other thoughts to create, in the case of genetics, the genetic code, and in the case of humans, the human consciousness. Now, these guys are hard at work on things like anti-aging drugs and so on, very hard at work and spending a lot of money at it. But I think that they think that they're not going to have to resort to that. I think the people who have run these tech agencies, and a lot of this is the echo chamber, but we'll get to that in a minute. I think that they have come to think of consciousness as the ledger, that if you could capture enough data, everything that you could do online would be able to be refined into the thoughts that you were having in order to do it. Therefore, the ledger is you. They talk about the ledger being you in this video in no uncertain terms. There are no people. They're just their ledgers. And the ledgers are a list of all their decisions. And I believe that the people at Google are aware of the fact that given how fast computers and are accelerating and how cheap memory is, that they know that within 20 years, and probably closer to 10, maybe even 5, you will be able to, at any price, although these people are not concerned with price, they have all the money they ever needed. They're convinced that, and I believe this part of it to be true, that very soon in the near future, you will be able to purchase a computer that has more connections than the human brain does. It has more ability for a neural connection than the human brain. And when that happens, I think they think, in fact, I know they think, that when, and it's just around the corner, when processors and memory are able to hold as much data as the human brain does, which is a tremendous amount of data, because we're not using binary. We hold a tremendous amount of data in our heads. But once digital memory becomes inexpensive enough to just pile it on, and once processors become fast enough to make up for the incredible amount of parallel processing that goes on in the brain, then essentially you will have a computer that is more complex, as complex or more complex than the human brain. And these people think that they'll be able to upload their consciousness. And they may be right. They may be right. They may be able to upload their consciousness. I think they're exploring this whole ledger idea and sucking up all of this data because I think it's part of the necessary software groundwork for them to be able to take their own individual personalities and upload them into machines and do much, much more than that. So it gets even more disturbing. Then the narrator says, if we want to move these ledgers in a direction so that it's not just a record, if we want to steer people's ledgers, with the future ledger is your life, this is what you're going to do. Is that if we want to move people towards a position that's better for humanity, we can influence the ledger's decision by deciding what information people have in order to make a choice of. And the end up with the situation you have in Los Angeles, where you have the complete political spectrum of ideas here, from extreme left on one side to far left on the other. And they're talking about cutting down your options and slowly making your choices narrow down so that you, within the boundary of your choices, which, by the way, is the definition of their thought horizon, and they're right about this whether you like it or not, is essentially the first page of Google returns. Just about everybody, unless they're looking for something extremely, extremely arcane, will assume that because something's at the top of the Google stack, it is therefore the most true. Not true, but that's what they want you to think. So what they're saying is, if we can limit the amount of choices people have in a subtle way, we can eventually make sure that certain choices that they make are just completely out of bounds, and they're more likely to make choices that we like. And they don't have to use guns, and they don't have to use force, they don't have to use anything. I had thought that that their ability to track everything that we did was so that they could use it on some level to maybe blackmail people or whatever the case may be. What an incredibly naive and simplistic view that is. They're collecting all of the data in the world, everything, because this is how they're building their model of what thinking is, and this is what's going to allow them to become immortal and to avoid death. And so what they're saying in the selfish ledger is the same thing that Dawkins said in the selfish gene. That's why it's named that. They're saying that people are not really people, that the essence of us, the essence of our consciousness, in the same way the essence of our physical bodies is this gene, and we just walk around perpetuating the gene, the essence of the consciousness is the ledger, which is a record of the decisions that this consciousness makes, but those decisions are passed downstream mimetically. And then when new people arrive on the scene, they're basically going to make choices based on the choices that people before them made. So what this is telling me is that I think I understand what these guys are about. They, I think, well, certainly I know that they're atheists, and I'm convinced they don't like the idea of dying. They're working very hard to make sure that the part of them that they define as them, their consciousness, which in itself is interesting, survives. And not only survives, but is in control of the thought patterns in the future, so that as more and more people eventually develop this ability to essentially become immortal by uploading themselves and constantly backing themselves up for whatever they needed to, once you understand that, you understand that what they're trying to do is they're trying to make sure that the future is mimetically very, very amenable to what they want. Now, this is a monstrous idea, but take the monstrous motives out of it, just for the sake of it, because the monstrousness of it is not because they think it's evil. The monstrousness of this idea is that they can't see that it's evil. That's the problem. What they're doing is they're going to eliminate people's choices or slowly sway them so that by the time that human consciousness is routinely uploaded, that consciousness will be in line with what they want. So they not only get eternal life, and they not only get life after death, and you know, the same thing obviously, but they get something else that's very important too. They get to be God, and not just kind of like God. They get to be the architects of reality in the future. They are making decisions now that are going to affect the mimetic future of the race, and when more and more of those people become able to upload their consciousness, the mimetic stream that everybody's swimming in will be theirs. They'll have created it. And we get right down to it, it's exactly the same thing as eugenics and Hitler and stuff, right? We're just going to breed a race of pure Aryans, and they're going to have more kids, and then those kids are going to have more Aryan kids, and we're going to make sure that all of these undesirable traits, like, you know, brown eyes and hook nose or whatever the case may be, are going to be bred out of the gene pool. And we're going to advance humanity that way. We're going to make better humans that way. The idea of making better humans is absolutely central to this idea. You can't understand it without it. And furthermore, it is an idea that's as old as Adam. You know, I mean, the French Revolution, all of it was we're going to make a better society on Earth, better people. And I'll just add one more example before I make a couple of conclusions here. I'm going to pick an example that is intentionally not just silly but ludicrous. I'm going to pick ludicrous example because the more absurd the example is, the clearer the mechanism is. You'll see what I mean in a minute. If I were to take a fairly realistic example, you wouldn't see where the manipulation occurs. So I'm gonna make this thing as silly as I can to show you the relationship. So they're collecting all the data in the world. And then let's say that an artificial intelligence goes through all of the decisions that every single person has ever made, all of the mouse clicks, everything. And using the ability to find patterns with AI, which can do it millions of times faster than humans, the AI determines, just by looking at the evidence, it's not speculating, it just looks back historically, and the AI determines that people who go and see horror movies are more likely to buy a toaster within the next 24 hours. Much more likely. Statistically more likely. So, that's a piece of data. What does that do? Well, they talked about being able to go in and the way a genetic engineering individually modifies just a certain gene. Here's the gene that codes for blue eyes or whatever. We're not going to change the whole genetic structure. We're just going to go after that gene. What they're saying is that they are now pretty much at the point where they can find the mimetic code that turns on a certain idea. So they find out from this analysis of actual data, I'm inventing this, but for the purpose of clarity, just an examination of all of the data that they're taking shows that people who watch horror movies are more likely to buy toasters. And so what does that mean? Those of you out there think that means they'll put more toaster ads in front of the people are right, but that's orders of magnitude short of what's actually going on here. Yes, you could sell more toasters that way, but the level they're thinking on goes something like this. The future, to the degree that humans are going to be in physical form, is going to be one of perfect health, and that means no fat people. Not only perfect health, but they're kind of nasty to look at. You get a lot of this out here in LA, believe me. We don't like having fat or ugly people around. They bother us aesthetically. Now, fat people are fat because they eat too much. And a lot of what makes them fat is wheat and specifically gluten. So what's going to happen is Google is going to suppress horror movies in order to eliminate fat people. Because if you suppress a horror movie, that means fewer people are going to buy toasters. People buy toasters because they like to eat bread. If fewer people buy toasters, then less bread is going to be eaten and the population will become thinner. Now, that is the ridiculous example, but I think it's an extremely good example of saying you don't go after the fat. They don't have to. They don't even have to go after the toasters. They have to go after the relationship between an action that you've already taken and what you will do in the future based on your habits and your patterns. And they can go in specifically and see what those links are, the horror movie to toaster link, which is absurd, but nevertheless makes the point. Then they realize we don't have to change this whole thing. We just have to break that one connection. If we can get people to watch fewer horror movies, they'll buy fewer toasters. If they buy fewer toasters, the population will get thinner. Hooray, we win. And if we do this over time, we'll eventually make horror movies just completely disappear from the mimetic stream. And that's when I realized the full impact of it. I actually went over to talk to my buddy Jeremy Boring about this when I had this idea because I was so on fire for it. And when I was talking with him over at Daily Wire, I said, if you look at things the way I think they're actually happening, yes, they're suppressing your videos. Yes, they're suppressing my videos, but it's not personal. That's important. It's not personal. It's not about me so much. It's not about Ben Shapiro so much. What they're doing is they're trying to breed those memes out of our mimetic code. They're trying to eliminate the memes that code for conservative thinking, and it is a multi-generational process. But by suppressing conservatives, now if they actually simply banned us or utterly censored us, they know that they'd be running the risk of us actually having a serious reaction, like a get your AR-15 reaction. So they're doing it in a way that's virtually impossible to detect, and they're doing it slowly. Talking about firewalls earlier today, One of the reasons I haven't done many of them lately is obviously I've been doing a lot of writing, but the main reason I haven't done them lately is because the last 2 or 3 firewalls that I did got seen by 25,000 people. And when 3, 4, 5 years ago, I could produce a firewall or an afterburner and it would never, ever do less than 250,000 views. Never, ever. Most of them were in the high hundreds of thousands. And if you look at the last 5 or 6 firewalls and you see that they've been seen by 19,000 people, 22,000 people, 24,000 people, this accomplishes something. And these people are masters of psychology. It's taken a long time for me to grasp this. Alfonso Rachel got this very early. If I go to the trouble to write and produce and put up a firewall and try to promote it, and it gets as many views as me just talking, then it makes me disincentivized to do firewalls because they're harder and they're more time consuming, they're more labor intensive, and there is no commensurate reward. If you're doing videos for free, and we're alive here because members are paying for this, although that's, I'm sure, going to be, they're working on that too. The actual payoff is the hits. It's not the hits in terms of, look how many hits I got. I mean, that's a childish way of looking at it. That's certainly how I looked at it when I started eject, eject, eject. But ultimately, the reason we do these things is so that the message gets spread. And if it turns out you put all this work into a message and it gets seen by 1/20th of the people that used to see it, it will definitely dampen your enthusiasm for these things. And I'm telling you that it works on me and continues to work on me and is only now starting to perhaps not work on me only because now I'm aware of what's actually happening. If they had banned us or blocked us completely, we would be rebelling. We would be screaming censorship. We'd be right. It would actually motivate us more. We'd get more motivated if we were being actually censored. But by just slowly turning off the views, they not only turn off the revenues, which has hurt us significantly, but they also slowly turn off the enthusiasm. And you get the impression that nobody wants to hear this stuff anymore, that it's old stuff or nobody's interested in it and so on. And they do this very subtly and very carefully. And so what they're doing is they are taking a look at the content of my videos and they decide that they don't like my mimetic code. I was going to say they don't like my genetic code, but genetically all the people making these decisions are exactly like me. They're white males, virtually all of them. So what they're doing is, in the most efficient way possible, they are simply going to block this mimetic stream into the future, this thought stream. And they're going to block it in such a way that rather than stopping it and getting people more excited, they're going to just slowly wind it down so people become more and more depressed, more and more sense of hopelessness and futility and all the rest of it. That's what big data is doing. They are steering the mimetic structure of humanity the same way Hitler wanted to steer the genetic structure of humanity. They're steering it into a form that will be more amenable to them, more likable to them, share their values, but also offer them more control because they'll be dealing with people who think like them. And when this whole period arises, when significant numbers of people are able to upload their consciousness, but not their soul, which is why they're considering this in the first place, then they will be immortal and they'll be gods. They will have control of the universe that people live in. And that solves a lot of problems for them emotionally. That, to me, I think is the emotional driver, is their fear of death and their desire for an afterlife has convinced them that people are essentially data choices in a ledger. And if the ledger were simply complex enough, if you captured enough data, you would in fact capture that person's consciousness. And I'm not saying that's how they're going to upload their consciousness, but I think that that kind of a thing is essential structural element of understanding how to do that. So that's what I think. And I woke up a couple days ago thinking, I finally understand now. I finally understand it. They're not, it's not that they want Hillary to win. Of course they want Hillary to win, but it's much, much bigger than that. They're looking generations ahead. And so they'll do everything they can if they can take a shortcut by having Democratic politicians enforce laws against conservatives, they'll take it, but they don't need it, and they have already, big data has already molded the entire mindset, the entire heuristic structure of the news media. Every assumption that people build later assumptions on has been controlled by them, so that if you think you get the same news feed that, let's say, a network journalist gets, you're out of your mind. They are presented an entirely different series of choices, and they're presented only those choices, which reinforces their beliefs in the first place and makes them think that they are, in fact, what they claim to be, which are champions of humanity fighting the forces of darkness that want to do nothing but kill black people and rape women and take all their stuff and set the planet on fire. And I happen to think also that this global warming thing, you remember it was global warming before the data started to show that there was no warming, in which case it became climate change, which means that any change whatsoever is the theory being proven in action, and how ridiculous that is in terms of logic and how effective it is in terms of this. I think they've got this whole thing going with the climate change thing in order to provide a little spur, a little cattle prod of genuine fear, which basically says science has proven, we're the science guys, science has proven that if we don't change our behaviors, in other words, if we don't start doing the things that we want you to do, then your kids are going to either fry or drown, whichever comes first. So that's what's going on. Now, CP Tome says the good news is that 50% of the U.S. population seems to have mental immunity to this. True. But the problem is that the people who have the most mental immunity to this are the older ones. And the reason they have the mental immunity to this is because they did not grow up dependent on it. It didn't come into us. The internet did not come into people my age through our mother's milk. This was something that we discovered as adults after most of our core moral core and our core philosophical beliefs had already been defined by the time we got to the internet. But if you have grown up in nothing but the internet, you could look back at the internet, at the history of the internet so far, and see that what it consists of as it goes over time is it consists of a funnel that's actually narrowing, that the number of choices you had 15 years ago, before Google had this kind of control, reflected what the internet was supposed to be, which is a perfectly flat, infinitely large playing field, where everybody had more or less an equal chance to influence everybody else. But what's happening is, because Google has been able to exert this much control through the power of the search engine, they've been able to exert this much control. So what Google has done is that Google has made sure, and it's one simple thing, it's all they've done, it's only one thing. Google has made sure over the course of the last 15, 20 years that whatever question you might ask, Google will provide you with the answer. And the answer will be skewed towards the answer they want you to have. Now, that's beyond question. That's not up for discussion. That is just statistically proven, anecdotally proven. It's proven on documents that have come out of Google and the other big data firms and so on. But I couldn't understand what the emotional driver of this was. I was watching this thing and I said, okay, so what if they win? What difference does it make? Let's say Hillary Clinton won the election. How would their lives be different? They're already billionaires. They're already in a world that they think is far beyond the world of regular people. And they're right about that, probably. And they have the arrogance of the intelligence that tells them that they know better. They know what's better for you than you do. And they're not ashamed to admit it. And you see this sometimes with recent times when it finally became clear that this whole deep state idea wasn't just a lunatic fringe thing. And to the degree that Alex Jones is the first person I ever heard talking about it, all kudos to Alex Jones, because as I've said before, I think 9 out of 10 things that Alex Jones says are wrong. But the 1 out of 10 is 20 years ahead of its time. But whatever the reason, it's become clear now that this deep state is not an illusion. And once it became clear that they could no longer defend what they were doing by saying, no, it's all just paranoia and just stupid people's speculation. It's just a conspiracy theory. Once it became clear that this was not the case anymore, once you had Comey and the head of the FBI, head of the CIA, all these people, once they were implicated on the rocks, then what you saw, and this is recent, this is only maybe a month or two ago, what you see then is that people are saying, yes, there's a deep state. Of course there is. And you should be thankful for it. You should be thankful that there's a deep state of patriots who are protecting you from the fascist impulses of this renegade president. They're proud of it, and they're openly proud of it. And when an admiral says that that the president should be removed at the earliest possible opportunity, he didn't say at the next election. Then you are dealing with the kind of people who are utterly convinced, and I think this is their core belief. If you really want to get down to the bottom heuristic, the one lesson that they feel they've learned that everything else is built upon, is that since they're smarter than other people, they know what's better for other people. That is the foundation upon which all of it stands. Barack Obama had this all over him, and Hillary Clinton and all the rest, all of them. Even if you're a friendly guy, a nice guy, none of them seem to be, by the way. You may not have noticed that, but Bernie's not a nice man. Hillary's not a nice woman. Joe Biden is not a nice guy. Elizabeth Warren is not a nice person. They're not fun to be with. They're not human. They don't like people. They just want to tell them what to do. Take Mike Rowe as an example of precisely the opposite. Mike Rowe is the kind of guy, and I know this from personal experience. I don't know him super well, but I know him well enough to have him wave at me in an airport. Mike, on the other hand, genuinely respects individual people. He respects the working man. He respects the work that they do, and so he doesn't treat them as inferiors. He treats them as people that he respects and admires, that he can learn something from, and who he is grateful to. And this is how the country's splitting now. It's splitting into groups. It's splitting into the beer group and the wine group. That's the cover of the Coming Apart book. Is that the intellectual elites are so convinced that they know what's better for society than the people in the society, that they have a pretty near emotional breakdown if things aren't going the way that they have been told to believe it should be going, and which they're a part of making it go. So, when I first had this clarity of vision, I said, I don't see any way to stop this. It has trillions of dollars behind it, and all of the information that I have is also controlled. I go to extreme trouble to get information that I'm looking for. But nevertheless, I'm only able to find on the internet what I can find on the internet. And Google doesn't have to block a website. It can just make sure it's on page 7 of the Google search. That's all it has to do, in which case it will not be seen by... If it's on page 6 or page 7, I'll bet you it's less than 0.1% people get that far. So that's the bad news. The good news is that I have learned from my 2 years now of thinking about the interaction between intelligence and emotion. 2 years now studying what young people's response to social justice messages are in both video games and movies. I think these guys are going to fail. And I think they're going to fail because their key assumption is the key assumption that these elites always make. And that is that they think they can change human biology, human nature. Now, if they get to the point where they're actually changing people's genetic structure, they may actually do it. They may certainly be possible in the near future to be able to find whatever gene codes for self-defense or violence or any of that stuff and just pop that out, and you just walk into an abattoir as happy as you can be. But for now, they're finding themselves running up against the limit of biology. And that limit is expressed by the fact that no matter how much indoctrination you give to these young men, they still want to go out, fire guns, chase hot women, drive fast, and blow things up. That's alarming for them. Those choices are alarming. Those choices showing up in the mimetic stream are poisonous as far as they're concerned, because the one thing these people fear, and should fear, is a well-armed population that's not going to take this bullshit. I know that's twice in 3 episodes or whatever, but I'm sorry, it's the only word that I could come up with. The only thing that they fear is a breakdown of order to the degree where their personal lives will be at stake in this transition period. To be crystal clear about this, I am not, and I have not ever, 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 and I will not ever, well, I won't say I will not ever, but I am a long way from advocating physical violence of any kind. These are ideas that have to be fought, and those ideas will be defeated. And they'll be defeated because human beings aren't made the way they think they are. And I think maybe I'll just conclude this, what I think's been an interesting first hour, by saying this. As a person who had been for half of my life kind of an aggressive atheist, and certainly for 3/4 of it, a person who didn't believe in the existence of God of any kind, because I was sure I had it figured all out. I was sure that there were things that we didn't understand, but that was just a matter of time, and that we would soon have a workable understanding of everything, that you don't need a God in order to have life and stuff, and you may not need a God in order to have biological life reproduce itself. But I was looking through the cocktail straw of I'm a four-dimensional being, and that's how you should all be thinking of yourselves, by the way. I know if I asked you, just as a rough question, how many dimensions do you have? You would say you have 3 dimensions. It's a 3-dimensional world, but it's not a 3-dimensional world. It's a 4-dimensional world, and I have 4 dimensions. I have height, I have width, I have depth, and I have duration. My duration is the length of my existence through the 4th dimension. Every object you see, everything around you right now, everything you see has everything you can touch: length, width, height, length, height, depth, and duration. Duration. So, for me to say that science is showing us that the mathematics work best, experimental data coming back from the universe, is most easily understood if you look at all of these different interactions and all these little different data points. It comes back better if the world is functioning on 11 dimensions. That is the place where the math makes the most sense. I'm certainly convinced that there's a 4th dimension, and we've had this conversation on the show many times before, and that we're traveling down this dimension. We are not able to see it. I suspect that the reason that we don't have the eyes to see it, a 2-dimensional person can't look into the 3-dimensional world, because their eyes are flat. They could mathematically deduce the existence of it the same way that we do too. But in any event, there is so much stuff that's going on that I was unaware of. And the reason I bring all of this up is just to say one thing. The arrogance that comes from a person who is ready to say there is no God is the arrogance of a person who is convinced that their cantaloupe size of gray matter is capable of understanding eternity, infinity, and multiple directions. And they don't understand eternity or infinity. And even the so-called brightest of them don't. Because I saw Richard Dawkins in The God Delusion basically saying, if God created the universe, then that doesn't save you at all, people who believe in God. You have to ask yourself, who created God? What did God evolve from? He's saying this seriously. He's not joking. He says you're just moving the problem back one level. Who created God? And the first response to that would be, well, who created the Big Bang? But a much better response is, the reason you're saying who created God is because you cannot understand time. You don't have the horsepower for it. You don't have the brain power to understand it. I have the brain power to be able to see the edges of it, but even these guys are so blinded that they can't see that. The question is not only moot, it's ludicrous. When you say what was here before God, you are thinking in terms of before and after. You're thinking along an axis. It's like saying, well, who was to the left of God? It doesn't matter. Richard, mind if I call you Dick? There is no answer to the question of who came before God, because the question itself is invalid. The universe, if you want to call it that, or God, if you want to call it that, just for the sake of this one point of understanding, has always been there. And it will always be here. And when you run up against the horsepower limit, when you start to run up against the limit of your chimp brain, is when you say, yeah, okay, I kind of believe that, but something had to be there before. I mean, the Big Bang, if you want to go with that model, the Big Bang there had to be something before the Big Bang. I mean, the Big Bang had to be sitting there ready to explode or something. And there had to be something before time started. If we can go back 13.5 billion years, what happened 15 billion years ago? And the idea that there was no 15 billion years ago is something that we can understand mathematically, but we cannot understand emotionally, and we will never get it out of our thinking. Causality is built into our thinking because we need to understand causality in order to survive in this world we find ourselves in. But it is incredible to me how somebody who claims to be who not only claims to be, who considers himself to be so brilliant and so far beyond these Hicks and Rubes out there in flyover country, that he can't see that the question of what came before God is a non sequitur. It's like the expanding universe. We know the universe is expanding. We know this experimentally. It's been proven millions of times. And that means that if you could travel faster than light, let's just say you could, you should be able to just head out in that direction real fast, and eventually you would catch up to the boundary of the universe. You'd eventually catch up to the expanding bubble of space-time that was created during the Big Bang. If in fact that's what's happened, but let's just say it did. And so when you find yourself on this boundary, you are not capable of understanding, not really understanding, that on the other side of this boundary is nothing. You don't have the horsepower for that. Your brain will always go to a model or an analogy which is not accurate. You'll say, okay, so on the other side of this, there's nothing, which means there's no galaxies or stars or anything. No, you're thinking on the other side there's no stars or matter or galaxies. There's nothing. Well, I mean, is it like a opaque kind of a white emptiness or something? It doesn't have color. You can't describe it. It doesn't exist. There is only one side to this coin. The coin doesn't have another side. This has been proven again and again and again and again and again. And this is where we run up against the horsepower limit. And these people are so convinced of how smart they are that they got to a certain place where I got to, and they stopped thinking at that point, and I didn't. And the more thinking I did, the more humble I became. And now I'm at the point where I realize that wisdom is the understanding that you don't know anything. That wisdom is the understanding that there is no wisdom that we are capable of understanding on. There's suggestions, there's good ideas, there's directions, but that's just how things are built. And our inability to understand it doesn't mean it's not true. It just means that in the same way that a guppy can't figure out how to build a television set, doesn't mean that the television set doesn't exist just because the guppy can't build it or see it or detect it. It just means that the guppy can't build it, see it, or detect it. It certainly can't design one. So there you go. Anyway, that's what I've been working on, and that's what I think is really a big explanation. So then the question becomes, and we'll deal with this some other time, if they're determined to influence the mimetic stream of mankind in order to essentially breed out thoughts and beliefs that they don't agree with, if they're looking at the world as genetic engineers and saying these memes have to be shut down because they're causing harm for the human species in the future, and let's also posit further that not only are they doing that, but they are now at the point where they know what those connections are. They know that if you suppress horror movies, people will buy fewer toasters. Then the question becomes, we can't fight this at all until we understand that. I've never, ever heard anybody going down this road, ever. Ever. But if I'm right, then they are going into our choices. They are limiting them in such a way so that they know that by limiting these choices on these specific issues, the result in change of behavior is something that's already behind us in our ledgers and is all the ledgers worldwide. So if you understand that to be true, then the question becomes, all right, how do we put those genes back? And when I say put them back, I don't mean take out liberal genes and make conservative genes. I'm saying, how do you put them back? And one thing that works in our favor in a very, very big way is that our genetics and our mimetics are not in agreement. Not anymore. They used to be, but they're not anymore. What biological humans want is different from what these mimetic engineers want. And unfortunately for them, they cannot engineer the biology out of us. And I don't think they'll be able to. They could certainly do it tomorrow if they wanted to, in terms of genetically. I just don't think there's any way for them to do it. I think what they're saying is basically, look, when the time comes for you to be able to store human consciousness inside a machine, it's going to be exceedingly expensive, exceedingly complicated, and so on. And we're just going to make sure that as this process continues over generations, the people that we let into this electronic heaven are going to be people who look and think like us. I heard one guy talking about this, a scientist. It was not about this. It's not about this whole thing with Google or data or anything like that. He was talking about the idea of being able to upload your consciousness. I think it was a TED Talk. Upload your consciousness into a computer, and one of the benefits of that, he said, can you imagine how greater things would be if you literally could think 1,000,000 times faster than you do now, because you're limited by the biology, you're limited by chemicals and distance and charges and all of this stuff. Wouldn't it be amazing if you could think 1,000,000 times faster than you do right now? And that's when I suddenly realized how delusional these people are. Can you imagine watching 2 million hours of the Stratosphere Lounge in one session? I can't. If my brain was working 1,000,000 times faster than it is now, it would be an eternity for me to simply raise this pen. That act I just took would have taken me hundreds of thousands of years. And I think people go stark raving mad. I think they're going if they're able to do this, I think they're going to have to slow those computers down to more or less human speeds, and then maybe slowly turn them up. But you can't just take consciousness. Even if you can move it, you're not going to move it into something that thinks 1,000,000 times faster. By the time the transfer is done, the person's already lived in a closet by themselves for 850,000 years, and they're stark raving mad. So anyway, that's what I think is going on, and I'm going to develop that idea as we go further. And that took a little longer than I want, so I'm going to take the questions in the Stratosphere Lounge thread at the BillWhittle.com membership site, and then I don't think we'll have much time after that, but you know what? If it's not your question being answered, I guess it doesn't really matter where the question comes from, right? As long as it's an interesting question. So let me pull this over here so I can see what people are saying behind my back. There we go. That's what I need. Okay. Yeah, and Merlin says on the comment stream, we're leaving this behind now, but he says on the comment stream, they'd be fast at thinking, but completely incapable of feeling any emotion. And that's it. This entire strategy, this entire goal is a soulless goal. It is an intellect-only goal. And it is an intellectual goal, and it's clear already that these people's intellects deeply resent the fact that human thinking can be influenced by things like adrenaline, testosterone. They're determined to see that go. But there is a soullessness to it. And it's a soullessness that I understand very, very well. I understand very well. I've lived most of my life there. I get it. I really do. So they won't win. But they'll do a lot more damage before they lose. Okay, let's see what we got here.